Hey everyone, there's a wedding going on in Cana, and the drinks are on Jesus. So, welcome back everybody. This is Living the Life 2, the ministry years. This is session 1.09. Today we're looking at Jesus at the wedding at Cana. So, I'm very tempted to kind of do a quick review back because for me it's been quite a while since I've recorded one of these. I've had various other things going on. Some of you will have been watching my Comes Under the Table video blogs. And all sorts of other things happening. Part of the problem is just we've been locked down in the UK, and the house has been full of people, so it's been trickier to just find the space to get away. It's nice and quiet to do these recordings. But anyway, we're back on it today. So let's go straight to the text. If you've been following these, you know we refer to it as the integrated text because we integrate all of the Gospels into a single narrative. But the events we're looking at the moment only appear in John, so it's not really that integrated. But I've kind of made slight amendments to the translation, all justified. I put notes. If you download the notes, there are notes and there's a translation notes as well that go with this session. If you look in the description underneath the video, you'll find them. You'll see all of my reasons for slight changes. I'll probably refer to them as we go. So starting in John chapter 2. So the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. So a quick comment on that third day. Because I remember I've got very confused. You read it. What third day of what? Third day of the wedding? All those, that seems kind of obvious, doesn't it? And you look in the commentaries and people argue about it. As time's gone on, I've taken the very simple view. I say it's a simple view, but it's one that we often miss. If you follow the narrative of John, the Pharisees have been coming to John saying, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" And then it says, and then on the next day, so it uses that phrase. So that's in John chapter 1. Where is it? So verse 27, he's saying, "Who comes after me? I'm not worthy to untie his sandal," and so on. Then the next day he saw Jesus. So there's a day there, one day. See, a next day there is Jesus. And he testifies to him, and then we read a couple of verses later, and the next day. So it's another day. So one day, 2 days now. So and the next day, and on that day, he's got two other disciples with him, and they follow Jesus, if you remember, and they refer to Jesus as Rabbi, and in doing so, it gives us a strong impression that Jesus is already teaching. And actually we're going to see that idea emphasised again here in this passage in the wedding at Cana, that Jesus already is a rabbi with disciples. He is already a recognised teacher within the context of John the Baptist's ministry. So they refer to him as rabbi, and one of them is Andrew. He goes and gets Peter. Peter comes and meets Jesus the next day. So the next day, so it says that one comes, and he then finds his brother Simon and said, "We found the Messiah," and then we have another next day. So how many next days have we had there? So the next day is after. Well, actually, maybe I've made a mistake here. I might have to start all over again. Let me. Yeah, no, that's right. In the text we've actually had 3 next days. So we've had a next day which was from day 0 to day 1. We've had the next day, which was day 1 to day 2. Then we've had the next day. Now, we tend to expand them out, which would mean that we probably think there's some extra days in as well. But technically, we've only had 3 next days, starting at 0. So we're actually on the third day when Jesus proposes to go to Galilee, and at that point, Nathanael comes to him, and so on. So I think that this little reference here, on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and Jesus and his mother. And the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus was invited. I think that is a kind of, if you like, a reference by John back to the third day that he's been telling us about. This kind of little run. So when we have read in the previous chapter that Jesus has proposed to go to Galilee, this is kind of now taking a step back to say in all those other bits, so don't forget, on that third day, the third of the next days that I referred to, this is why Jesus is going to Galilee. Now, it's going to take him a few days to get from Bethany down in the south, Bethabara, as we've thought about it already. It's going to take Jesus a few days to get from there back up to Galilee. But it's the context of that wedding that is there on the third of John's next days that Jesus is going to. And he's going because he knows his mother will be there. And it says, and he's been invited and his disciples to the wedding. So it's not that Jesus has been invited and he feels free to take his disciples, but there is a kind of a general invite, which again tells us, if you stop and think back a little bit, it shows us that Jesus is already ministering as a teacher. It's just a kind of quick historical context. Rabbi as a formal title doesn't really come into play until after the destruction of the temple. But as a kind of casual title, it has a very similar meaning. It's not dissimilar if you think about in other kind of religious orders. You go back kind of centuries and centuries, and a monk would turn up, and he's very revered, so they call him the very reverend. The very revered monk is the very reverend monk. And then as the monasteries and other things become more formalised, eventually very revered becomes very reverend, becomes the formal title to the person who leads the movement, you see. So there's a kind of a casual use of a title which becomes formalised, and actually we find similar with the word rabbi. So it is a title in Jesus' day, but it isn't really got a formal position with it in the same way as it does after the destruction of the temple. The reason why it's worth mentioning that is occasionally you'll get someone who wants to be obtuse that says the Gospels weren't written before, they're not historical because rabbi wasn't a formal title in Jesus' day. No, it is a casual title though. Hillel, a couple of generations before Jesus, is being referred to as a rabbi and so on. It's just, it doesn't have kind of, if you like, fixed things around it, which means when we come at it, we can't say, oh, he must have this many disciples, because we find those debates after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But we know that he is being recognised and he has disciples. And in this context here, the wedding at Cana, those disciples have been invited with Jesus. So it tells us that he's got a certain amount of established recognition in there, that it's okay for him to come, and it's okay for him to bring his disciples up with him. So off they head, back to the text, which is what I was supposed to be doing anyway. In Cana of Galilee, Jesus' mother was there, so both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. Now, having run out of wine, Jesus' mother laid it out to him, they've got no wine. And Jesus responded to her, woman, what's that got to do with you and me? My hour has not yet come. And his mother explained to the servants, whatever he might say to you, you should do it. And it's interesting, there's a whole host of things that kind of come into play in those few verses. So Jesus has got there. It's now going to be more than 3 days because it will take a few days to travel up to Cana. There are actually a couple of possible locations of Cana. There's not much distance between them. I've put on the map, which I'll put on the screen for you. I think technically there are about 4 locations that can go by the name of Cana, but 2 of them I think are in Syria. There's only 2 that are actually in Galilee. This is Cana of Galilee, so the 2 I've kind of marked on the map. They're just a few miles north of Nazareth. So it's not really very far. It's kind of, it's only a couple of hours walk. You walk there and back in the day, no problem. And so there is something of the kind of family context in this. And here is Jesus' mother, and Jesus has known that the wedding is coming. And he knows he's invited, and he knows his mother's going to be there. So it seems that there's some sort of familial connection. And we'll kind of play that out in a little bit. So in this thing, his mother feels some level of responsibility. And so that's actually led some people to speculate that this is a family wedding in the immediate sense, maybe one of Jesus' sisters or a brother. And I think that's not impossible. But I think is less likely given the way Jesus responds. But Mary is clearly close enough to the mix that she feels some responsibility, even if ultimately she isn't the one who is responsible in this situation. So she says they've got no wine, and Jesus responds to her, woman. And in the modern world we think of that's how rude to say that, he should call her mummy. But actually conventions how to address parents change all the time, and Jesus is just totally within the context of the ancient world. As an adult addressing his mother, she is the woman, he's the man. So it's just a kind of a straight way of addressing without perhaps doing her the indignity of just casually using her name. So woman is a kind of almost formal title. What's that got to do with you and with me? In other words, yes, we can feel an emotional response to it, but we don't have technical response. And so that kind of brings that sense in which it probably is Jesus' wider family that his wedding is taking place in, and that raises this kind of whole question as well. Well, it raises several questions actually. One which is worth just touching on now, which is of course Jesus is now in his 30s and he's not married, which almost certainly tells us that he has made a choice early on in life to kind of give himself to some sort of teaching role. So again, it kind of fits into this idea of Jesus' understanding of the place of a teacher, which is kind of almost invisible to us, is technically there. It's kind of it is being addressed in the Gospels. It's just not being unpacked because it belongs to a phase of Jesus' life that's a little bit fuzzy. And the Gospel writers, the disciples and apostles, who the Apostles' Creed that then becomes the Gospels, aren't exploring it because it's not clear enough to them. They may know bits of it, and we've lost that context, but it's clearly there. It's kind of being referenced in, because if, as at the age of 30, Jesus is not married, he's either probably been married and widowed. We don't have any hint of that, but more likely he has made the choice of the kind of things we read about in the Qumran community and so on, where people who give themselves to the kingdom, and Jesus refers to those who are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom, and it's a kind of a deliberate choice. And so probably Jesus' participation with John, which we see around the baptism area, which may, as we've touched on before, have gone back even further, and maybe even taking trips down to Qumran, which people did do to go and learn and so on, that Jesus, for his own sake and his own growth and his own education, guided by the Holy Spirit, has participated in his own learning and probably experimented in his own teaching. And so he has a bit of that history as a roving teaching rabbi, as we're going to see, which we kind of lose sight of. And that's probably why he himself isn't married. That it's a deliberate choice of his, and that's understood. Jewish culture, family is everything, except unless you've kind of committed yourself in these ways for spiritual reasons. Made yourself a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom. So that kind of understanding predates Jesus. It's kind of there. It would have been understood of John the Baptist, for instance. He was taking that similar role. But it kind of you do get, every now and again, particularly if you go on YouTube and go on the internet, you get these theories about Jesus trogged off to India and spent years learning there, and that's why he's such a wise teacher, which is not what the Bible says. The Gospels tell us something again which plays in here. Luke's Gospel, it talks about after his experience in the temple as a 12-year that he continues to Nazareth, and it talks about how he lived in subjection to his parents. And now obviously at the start of Jesus' ministry it seems that his father is passed on now, he's no more. We meet Jesus' uncle towards the end of the Gospel narratives, his father's brother, Cleopas or Clopas, but we'll leave that till we get there. But at this early phase of Jesus' ministry, it does seem that Joseph is dead. But we've been told by Luke he's grown up in subjection to them around Nazareth. So he's not trogged off down to India, he's kind of lived within that context. At some point though his father has presumably died. And maybe that marks a transition in Jesus' learning place, and maybe he's able to kind of go a bit more and subject himself to people like John the Baptist in his learning. But at the same time, Jesus, it seems, wouldn't have done that if his mother wasn't in a secure place. But of course he has brothers and he has sisters, and there's a kind of a family network and so on. And it's into that kind of context that Jesus will be returning here as he goes back for the wedding in Cana. So anyway, we're doing an awful lot. We're saying an awful lot. We haven't really read the text yet. Then the other thing just to notice, is of course this marriage motif is at play again. I referred to this a few sessions back. Remember at the baptism of Jesus, which is, the words aren't recorded in John's Gospel, but this is my son, the beloved. We get rid of the word there and we just, my beloved son. This is my beloved son. We squeeze it all up, but it's the beloved, and the beloved is a title for the bridegroom in Song of Solomon. And we find that Jesus picks up right from the very beginning of his ministry, as it's recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, that one of the first things he teaches is when the bridegroom's not here, then they'll mourn, which is direct reference to a prophetic image in Jeremiah, And of course, that idea of the bridegroom who's there and there's celebration and it gets cut short and everybody's mourning, but then they return. It's the resurrection and they're all cheering. that kind of prophetic image that is there in the book of Jeremiah, Jesus picks up right from the beginning of his ministry. And although John doesn't record the words the beloved, as in the baptism story, although he doesn't give us the beloved, one of the things that's been commented on by countless writers on John's Gospel is that marriage is a strong motif right the way through his Gospel. And it appears here, everything starts with a wedding. And not only does it start with a wedding, but it seems that Jesus' mother has some level of understanding that something of the teaching of Jesus is relevant to weddings, because he responds to her, "My hour has not yet come," which implies that there's something in the discussion that's happened. You think, well, okay, so how does that relate to the disciples of Jesus as they stand at the moment? And that's hard to say, but we do know from Luke that the reference to being subject to his parents is then followed by a statement about his mother storing up all of the things about him. And that kind of implies to us that even perhaps after Joseph has died, that there's something discussional that's gone on. She's observed the events and things that Jesus in his natural wouldn't remember, like the angels at his birth and the coming of the wise men and so on. And she stored those kinds of things up. But this is beyond that. It's actually about while he's growing up. She's storing stuff up, which implies that there's some level of discussion between the two. And we see an element of that coming out here now in this narrative, because she's at a wedding, and the idea of the concept of the beloved, the bridegroom, which is going to be a key part of Jesus' understanding of himself, which becomes an overarching narrative that kind of encompasses the whole of the New Testament. So the book of Revelation is all about the final marriage supper of the Lamb and his bride, and so the consummation of everything is kind of that whole thing arcs from start to finish. John, of course, is the author of Revelation as well, so he's actually given us this first public sign, which kind of matches with, if you like, the final fulfillment that he's going to write about in the book of Revelation, is this idea of marriage. And in this context, which is just a family wedding, some level of family that's involved, Jesus' mother knows there's something of this that somehow seems significant to her, that when she asks the question, one, there is personally a local kind of familial sense of responsibility and what do I need to do about this that she's responding to. But beyond just that, there is something of the theological understanding of something that Jesus is coming to do that she's perhaps referring to. And so then Jesus says, what's it got to do with us? But what's really interesting is we now see, in one sense, Jesus being subject to his mother. Because she doesn't argue with him particularly, but she just knows, that the way he is with her. And she goes to the servants, so we read it. So my hour has not yet come, so is what he says. And that's true. It's not going to be for 9 months that he's going to start, if you like, the really public side of his ministry. He's ministering, but in kind of private context with disciples, small synagogue meetings, this kind of thing. Like a practicing rabbi, someone who's developed the teaching, understanding and sharing it. But he's not really gone public with a big message at this stage. That's still 9 months away, roughly. My hour has not yet come, but his mother explained to the servants, whatever he might say to you, you do it. And again, you get the sense of she has some standing because the servants need to listen to her. She's not just some busybody woman. She goes and says to them, and so again, it does kind of tie in some sense. It probably looks like wider family. There's some sort of wedding going on in the mix. Jesus' family don't have ultimate responsibility, but they have emotional responsibility into it, and she gives them that message. Now, there were 6 stone water jars standing there, as required by the way of Jewish purification. And I think I put them in the notes. I never get my Greek words correct, but the metatras, it's about 37 litres, 37.5 litres. These are big jars, great big jars, which are used for washing. And each with space for 2 or 3 metatras. There it is. In other words, it's about 75 litres. Sorry, I'm not doing it right. It's about 75 to 113 litres big. And Jesus said to them, fill the water jars with water. So they filled them up to the brim. And next he said to them, draw out some water and take it to the master of ceremonies. So they took it. And we know where it's going. We know that Jesus turns water into wine. And again, just the layers on layers, because the thing I absolutely get enthusiastic about with Scripture is there's so much in life that can make you cynical. But Scripture is so multi-layeredly rich. Whenever I feel doubts around my faith, I go and see some of these amazing cross-references, and I think this is remarkable. The book is absolutely remarkable, because we're finding another kind of pattern resonance going on in Jesus' life here. That Jesus' first miracle is turning water into wine. So that suddenly ties in with the beginning of Exodus, doesn't it? Because the first miracle in the Exodus is the turning of water into blood. Moses takes the water and pours it out, and it becomes blood, and then eventually the whole river turns to blood. But what's fascinating is you actually find, although it's not spelt out as a deliberate thing by any one of the gospel writers, if you put all of the gospels together, as we're going to do, what we actually find is that every event in the Exodus, or the flow of events, and all of the plagues and so on, are all replicated or reflected in order, and that's really key, in order in the ministry and life of Jesus. So here it starts with the first one, pouring out of water, which in the Exodus becomes blood, and the blood causes the fish to die. The next miracle we're going to read about, although it takes place 9 months later, is the multiplication of fish, or the discovery of fish. If you remember, it's at the calling of Peter to leave his home. It's not the first time he's met Peter, but it is now come and travel with me. And at that point, Peter's been fishing all night, puts down his nets and comes up with a huge catch, and Jesus says, you'll be a fisher of men, you see. So you got blood and then you got fish. Now, I'm not going to kind of spell it all out. I wrote it up. I haven't got one right next to me, but I'll put it again on the screen. An image of the little book I wrote, Jesus and the Great Escape, which is looking at the book of Exodus, the story of the Exodus, and seeing how it resonates with Jesus. So in that book, we spelt out how all of the things flow. It's kind of easy at the end. You see it quite quickly, because remember at the end of the Gospels there is darkness, and the second to last plague is a plague of darkness. And then Jesus dies, the begotten Son, the only begotten Son of the Father, dies, and the firstborn all die in the story of Exodus, you see. And as you kind of go through, you might think, in the Exodus, well then after the fish was the frogs. Where are the frogs? Where are the frogs in the Gospels? Well, they're not in the Gospels, sort of, but the frogs in the New Testament, you find in the book of Revelation, become symbols of spirits going out into the earth, you see. It's the only thing that they're used for in the New Testament is as a symbol of the demonic going out. And we actually find Jesus releasing people of demonic spirits, the frogs kind of suddenly coming into play. So anyway, I won't do it here, but you can do that if you want to get the book. Or I think I've done some teaching on the Great Escape online. You can find it on one of my videos, I'm sure, to see the way in which all of the events of the Exodus are kind of paralleled in the life of Jesus. It's kind of retelling the story, but with a new angle, because whereas when the first thing, water becomes blood and it brings death with it, now it's actually wine, and there's life and there's multiplication of fish. But you kind of get that kind of mix, that feel. So, let's keep going. I said I was going to read the text and then do it. We're kind of unpacking the text as we go through. So Jesus told them, fill the water jars with water. They filled them all the way up to the brim, and next he said to them, now draw some out, take it to the master of ceremonies. So they took it. So when the master of ceremonies tasted the water, now become wine, but he didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. So the master of ceremonies called the bridegroom and said, look, everyone serves the good wine first, and when the guests have drunk freely, then they serve the inferior. But you've kept the good wine until now. And so, as I said, we've already seen there are loads of potential things within this, but the way in which the gospel writer John looks to draw it out is that something is coming that is better than what was there before. He uses it in that way for that really simple thing. What you had, you thought was good, and normally it's the other way around, isn't it? All things are never as good as they used to be. We look back with nostalgia, but actually what he's saying is we're not. We're going to see that what is coming is so qualitatively different. It's going to be a surprise. What on earth did you do it that way for? That's not the way these things are supposed to work. We're supposed to look back with kind of affection. Actually, we're looking back going, it was good, but wow, look where we are now, which is a really lovely kind of way of using the story in this context. But you kept the good wine till now. So Jesus performed this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and so revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And again, just kind of drawing it out. This is before Jesus starts with his public message in a public place, but he's already operating as a rabbi. He's already teaching. And that's probably been going on for a little while already, and it's going to go on for a few more months before Jesus is eventually going to turn up at Capernaum, which he's going to visit anyway in between time. But he's going to turn up in Capernaum with a new thing, which is, right, we're going on the road now. We're going to do something different. And the disciples are going to gather with him and leave. But I don't want to say too much more because I don't want these sessions to be too long. But there's probably more that can be said. I say there probably is. There is more that can be said. A lot of it's just speculative, but hopefully you've got a sense as we've kind of done this during this session, the kind of the richness of possibilities and the kind of the likelihoods in terms of what's going on. I haven't touched on, of course, which is part of the narrative, that the Eastern weddings take place over multiple days. The marriage supper of the Lamb and the bride really are happening through the ages. They've started already. They start with the arrival of Jesus and they finish at the throne room, but they take place over multiple days. All this kind of imagery and so on that's there. But we'll be touching it, no doubt, as we kind of work through the rest of the kind of gospel text. We're going to see it keeps coming back. So we won't spend too long now. So my apologies for those of you who've been following these live, because there's been quite a big gap between the last one we did and this one. But my hope is now to get into a slightly more regular rhythm, try and get something out per week, and we'll work through through this integrated gospel text. So thanks ever so much for taking the time to watch this. I hope you got something out of it. If you've got questions, please feel free to post them in the comments below, and I'll see if I can address them as we kind of record these going forwards. So until next time, when of course we will be looking at Jesus' kind of visit to Capernaum. Oh no, it's actually Passover, isn't it? Hang on, where is it? Yeah, oh yeah, okay, I probably should finish verse 12 actually. I haven't read that. I went to verse 11 now, I think. Verse 12, we should finish with verse 12. And after this he went to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and there they stayed for a few days. So after the wedding, in the aftermath of the wedding, rather than all returning to Nazareth, for some reason the whole family go down to Capernaum. And as we've touched on before, there is the possibility that Jesus has familial connections with the family of John. It's not 100%, but it's a good possibility. And that would kind of make sense of all of them going down there. And of course that allows Jesus to get to understand and see and meet and know Peter and Andrew and Philip in their kind of home context. And when it says here a few days, we're very precise with the way we use language. The ancient world is less so because they're not so driven by clocks. So a few days can be a few weeks, if is the way of putting it. It doesn't mean 3 or 4. It just means he's not there forever and ever. It's not a big story that we want to tell you about. He's just there for a while. The next thing we're going to think about, which we'll do next week, is Jesus' first Passover encounters with the temple. So we'll look at that next time. So until then, I'll say goodbye, and hopefully you've enjoyed this session. Thanks then. Bye then.